Okay, so just 2 ticks. We're waiting for the live stream. Oh Lord. Okay, YouTube with our Centenary. All right. So now back into this. Got it. Share the screen. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. As I say, it seems like ages since we've done an event. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I think you should be able to. Yeah, we've had 1 or 2 things live. We were so fortunate to have Dr. McMaloney, God love him, the week before he died, with Lenny Sloan. They did an amazing talk in-house here about the meeting and the different interactions between African Americans and Irish in America, some of which of course were cooperative and more of which were not so cooperative. But they touched on the melting pot of culture that we have, and a lot of that, of course, to the benefit of the world, as we have Irish dance and all kinds of tap dance and different fusions that both groups brought together. And then we have a very busy September, October, November coming up, you'll all be glad to know. So a lot of the talks will be back in person. We will live stream them, but in one way, the live stream is almost always better when you are just doing it live, because you're in a situation like this where, the PowerPoint is very good. You can see the speaker. When we live stream them from our theatre, sometimes the lighting gets in the way and all that. But it's, we like to be able to offer them, to a broader audience than just who can come in person. So keep an eye. The September newsletter is almost ready, and I think we have updated our Facebook and YouTube website with those events already. So we have a new, very exciting Great Hunger series starting. We've actually planted a Great Hunger Memorial Garden out in our courtyard here with the help of the Department of Foreign Affairs and their Immigrant Support Programme. And so kind of to help launch that garden, but also to commemorate the 175th anniversary of Black 47, we're doing a lecture series with professors both in America and at home to talk about different aspects of the famine and the consequences of it. So I'm looking forward to that. But anyway, we'll get on to tonight's program. And so anyone live on the Zoom can type in their questions and stuff using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Or you should be able to make yourself heard at the end. You can turn on your microphone and all that. Those on YouTube can also type questions, and I'll answer them at the end. So we're picking up this Centenary Series, which we had been doing monthly for a while because the War of Independence was so busy, and then we sort of took a break because not only does Albany summers get odd and people were away on vacation and stuff, but also the Civil War itself was kind of a slow burner. So we're starting here in August, which of course happened to be one of the hardest months for the new state, because the Free State side lost Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins, and of course the anti-treaty side lost Harry Boland and Cathal Brugha. But the Civil War itself, as I said, was a kind of a slow burner. These deaths absolutely speed up the retaliation and the viciousness of the retaliations that happen afterwards on both sides. But when we finished in March, we were talking about the fact that both sides were preparing for the election. We know that they had formed this pact. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. The War of Independence technically was kind of still going on in the north of Ireland. There was a lot of pogroms against Catholics, many of whom fled south of the border. We know that Collins, was actively arming the IRA up there. So violence had stopped in the south. They were kind of going out electioneering by early March, and then it kicks off. So I was on radio the other day, Radio Free Erin, and we were saying, part of what happens, I think, is the fact that even though the treaty split had seemed to fairly divisively win, the vote in January, what seems to have happened was there was a hardline section of fighters who weren't happy to lay down their arms. They had been fighting for, you know, a 32 county Ireland, must have experienced a terrible sense of betrayal. They'd been on the run for 2 years with the Black and Tan War. You know, they're definitely experiencing PTSD. I can't remember what historian I read one time, and he was saying about, like, apparently the levels of alcoholism among these men who, when they finally stopped, when there was that ceasefire against the war against the Black and Tans, you know, these men who had been living on pure adrenaline and sleeping rough for years sort of crashed, you know. So it must have been very difficult for some of them to accept this kind of not a full republic, you know, even the term free state. And we mentioned when we were talking about those earlier talks, actually partition was kind of not really all that contested. You know, the hopes that this boundary commission would sort things out sort of kicked the can down the road a bit. And so that was not most of what people were talking about, you know. Naturally, some people were. But the Civil War proper, you could say, started on June 28th, when the National Army, commanded of course by Collins, attacked the anti-treaty group who had been occupying the four courts in Dublin, I'll go back to this, since April of that year. The four courts garrison, you know, give up after about 60 hours, but they are in occupation of the four courts since April. So on the 13th of April, the night of the 13th, 200 troops led by Rory O'Connell and Liam Mellows took control of the four courts in Dublin. And so this kind of, you know, there's street fighting, there's not a lot going on, but they're in control of the four courts at the time, and there are lots of different skirmishes. The Catholic hierarchy on the 26th of April issues a statement supporting acceptance of the treaty. But what's really heating up in April and May is, of course, the run up to the election. So we know that Collins and Javalera in May agree a pact that basically would provide that Sinn Féin candidates in the June election were not really going to mention the fact that they were pro or anti-treaty. They would, you know, work as Sinn Féin candidates, electioneer campaign as Sinn Féin candidates, and then the winners would, you know, form a coalition government. So this was a way of staving off this kind of violence, I suppose, you know. 14 people are killed in sectarian attacks in Belfast in May, and a member of Parliament, Twaddle, is shot dead. And then 2 police officers in Belfast later that month provoked massive reprisals. Over 80 Catholic families are burnt out of their homes. So this third election that's happening was technically to elect members to the third Dáil. The 1918 election had been regarded by nationalist Ireland as basically a referendum on independence. So Sinn Féin basically won all of the seats practically in Southern Ireland. Its elected representatives met in Dublin instead of Westminster, which of course is the policy still pursued by Sinn Féin today, and they called themselves the first Dáil. Elections to the Parliament of Southern Ireland were mandated by that 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which was really the 1912 Home Rule Bill, you know, that had kind of come of age. But Sinn Féin treated that as if it was the second Dáil. And so, as I say, they present this united ticket, and you know, they had kind of survived the 1921 elections, but the treaty obviously renders it, you know, null and void. So Michael Collins, on behalf of the pro-treatyites, Eamon de Valera for the anti-treatyites, signed the pact, as I say, that all candidates would fight the election just as Sinn Féiners. This agreement recognised that other candidates would run as well, because actually the Labour Party had been very much sidelined in the 1918 election. The Democratic programme was written mostly by the Labour Party, but they had kind of agreed to stand down in those 1918 elections so that an umbrella organisation of Sinn Féin candidates could kind of take over. So the Labour Party nominated 18 candidates in this election, and the Farmers Party put out 13. So 20 of the 28 seats had elections, as opposed to Sinn Féin running unopposed, you know, in the second time they had elections. And there was 8 other districts, including Dublin University, and 7 in the West. The incumbent TDs were re-elected without a challenge, but 20 of 28 seats, you know, had elections. Some of these non-Sinn Féin candidates were again under pressure not to stand. The assertions from Sinn Féin that the entry of these other interests would threaten national unity carried some weight, but of course there was intimidation used at other times. And so both minority parties ran fewer candidates than they had originally announced. In Carlow and Kilkenny, the House of the Farmers Party candidate, Dennis Gorey, was shot at, but he stood his ground and remained in the contest. Clare, the Labour Party, Patrick Hogan, was urged to withdraw his candidacy as the nomination deadline approached. Interesting that we're talking about elections today. Of course, there's primaries in New York State. And the legal assessor actually turned back the hands of his watch to give Hogan more time to make the desired decision, which finally he did. Independents often, of course, encountered a less than warm welcome as well, but 21 of them eventually stood in support broadly of the treaty. So the campaign, and I'm showing you some of the posters here, went quite smoothly. Both factions of Sinn Féin temporarily put aside their differences by frequently sharing platforms from which they urged their voters to support the panel candidates without arguing about the merits of the treaty. The necessity to maintain national unity was a recurring theme, along with, sort of irritation that other candidates had exercised their option to run. The appearance of unity comforted many people in Ireland, but the emergence of electoral contests that made these divisions in Irish society, not just over the treaty, but over social and economic issues, especially when these were made explicit, it was unwelcome, really, to some within Sinn Féin. This was partly out of self-interest because it upended the simplistic idea of a monotheist political culture where everyone was assumed to have the basic worldview, the same as everyone else's. And so some of the pro-treaty counterparts, for instance, like Ernest Bly and Arthur Griffith, absolutely extolled the virtues of the treaty. Anti-treaty Sinn Féin candidates, particularly at the start of this campaign, perhaps sensing the unpopularity of their cause, because don't forget, most of the country had spoken in January when they were talking to their elected representatives. So anti-treaty in general did stick to the agreement that all the Sinn Féin candidates should urge support for just Sinn Féin as a party. Now, I think it's worth highlighting here, however, and we talked a little bit about Javalera's speeches in March, particularly in our last one, but he did make several speeches, I'm going to quote for you now. If the volunteers of the future tried to complete the work the volunteers of the last 4 years have been attempting, they would have to complete it not over the bodies of foreign soldiers, but over the dead bodies of their own countrymen. They would have to wade through Irish blood, through the blood of the soldiers of the Irish government, and through perhaps the blood of some of the members of the government in order to get Irish freedom. So, of course, that it's hard to know if that was a warning or a threat. Javalera insisted that speech, which he gave in Thurles on St. Patrick's Day, highlighted the dangers of the situation. But of course, his opponents, accused him of inciting violence and certainly raising the tension. And the speech, unfortunately, was not the only one in that tone. He, gave a series of talks across the south of Ireland with a lot of the same message. He told a crowd in Dungarvan that it was only by civil war after this that they could get their independence. In Waterford, he claimed the only choice left now was acceptance of the so-called treaty or civil war. In Killarney, the day after Thurles, that kind of particularly violent one, he said the volunteers would have to march over the dead bodies of their own brothers if they continue to seek full independence, adding significantly, and I hope they will continue. So, that's, I'm just showing you some of the things here. There's one of the Labour candidates, and here's one of those speeches. And then that's Rory O'Connor, who, don't forget, is inside in the forecourt by the time this is happening. And here's Michael Collins giving these speeches. Now, I'm hoping that this will work for me. Yeah. So this is a reenactment of Michael Collins's speech in 1922, and I just want to play, the very start of it for you. Is it going to work? No. Sorry, he's just taking his time. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I couldn't find a transcript of the speech. I just didn't have time today while I was looking, but this is a reenactment that they did in Cork. I don't know, was it this year or last year, the Michael Collins House Museum? So obviously you can see it on YouTube, and they started it with the proper pathé footage. So, yeah, so hopefully now you can find it. There's just a long delay at the start. So, you know, I think that's an interesting dichotomy with between the rhetoric that both sides are using. You know, now the anti-treaty side blame Collins quite late in the election campaign. He encouraged attendees at a Cork gathering on the night actually of the election to vote for the candidates you think best, which the anti-treatyites argued was against the agreement, you know, because he seemed to be sort of allowing his supporters to support non-Sinn Féin candidates if they wanted. So these elections, you can see there, the Free State Army had to be called in to protect, you know, a meeting up in Sligo, that's in April. Both sides were able to claim, you know, some level of success because of the outcomes. There was 239,193 votes to the pro-treaty side and 133,864 for the anti-treaty. 247,000, give or take, people voted for other parties, all of whom technically supported the treaty, aside from the Unionist Party. So although its success percentage in the constituencies where there was a fight was lower, Sinn Féin as a whole gained a majority of seats. So the Sinn Féin party gained 94 of the 128 seats, and the majority of those were pro-treaty Sinn Féiners. Only 4 of the 20 contested constituencies produced a complete Sinn Féin panel, and 27 incumbent TDs lost their seats, with the anti-treaty crowd suffering particularly severe defeats. 22 of their incumbents lost the seats, and not a single anti-treaty contender led any polls. This was also, by the way, the first election that used proportional representation. So in the 16 constituencies where both factions had candidates, the pro-treatyites garnered more votes in 11 of those, and anti-treatyites in just 5. In each of which they had the advantage of having more candidates than the pro-treatyites. So they kind of won through force of numbers rather than through votes, if you get me. The anti-treatyites were particularly weak in Leinster, taking only 5 of the 44 seats there. Munster, of course, they did quite well. Overall, Collins was entitled to claim popular endorsement of his backing for the treaty as being the freedom to achieve freedom. So, you know, Labour, all but one of Labour's candidates were elected. The party received more than 21% of the vote, a percentage that it hadn't surpassed for a long time. Because he was the only candidate who provided the voters with the possibility of breaking the frigid chain of silence that has tied them since 1918, the candidate in Louth and Meath won by a sizable majority of votes. There were 10 independent candidates, including the 4 unionists from Trinity College, and they gave seats in addition to the Farmers' Party, which won seats in all of the constituencies it ran in except for 1. The underrepresentation of women, of course, which, you know, was now going to become a long feature of Irish politics, was very pronounced. Don't forget, a lot of the women had been violently anti-treaty. Only 2 of the 128 TDs, Mary McSweeney and Kate O'Callaghan, who were both anti-treatyites, were women. This election also marked the foundation of a new and enduring party political system in Ireland. Today's Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil can both claim direct continuity from the anti-treaty wing of Sinn Féin, and Fine Gael, through Common Gael, can claim it's descended from the pro-treaty wing. We do still, of course, have Labour and independents powerful and present in Ireland, but the Farmers' Party has disappeared. Now, this all brings into question Javalera and how he's feeling I think, his loss of control was kind of quickening. He was no longer the majority in the fractured national movement, and as more militant and extremist voices attempted to take the reins, he was really at risk of losing control. And I think for a time did lose control of the anti-treaty side. He had people like Rory O'Connor, who was taken over the four courts. Rory was the acting military council's head for the IRA's anti-treaty faction. He was even disputing the legitimacy of the Dáil. He said not long after the Thurles speech that Javalera gave, if a government makes a mistake, it must bear the costs. We are in uprising against the Dáil if it is the country's government. So Javalera later acknowledged that it had been foolish of him, quote, to back O'Connor in the unfortunate rejection of the Dáil. He says he did it in an effort to avoid a further split within Republican ranks, which would weaken again the chances of defending the treaty. But this meant that he was not really in a position to lead, and he was now kind of tied to the more extreme doctrinarian Republicans in his wing. So as the violence starts to heat up, he's not in charge of the IRA for sure and certain. And the only way he can reclaim his power is to try to reassert the primacy of politics. And so this attempt at the election pact with Collins was maybe part of that. So, he was still sort of in the running until Sinn Féin anti-treaty do not win the election with the numbers they should have. So not only a couple of days after the election in June, there's an IRA convention at the Mansion House in Dublin, which splits on the issue of resuming the offensive against British troops. And then, of course, don't forget the guys are in the four courts. And then this is complicated by the murder in London, the assassination of Lord Wilson or Henry Wilson by IRA men. They were retaliating for attacks against Catholics in Northern Ireland. It appears now actually that it was the pro-treaty leader, Michael Collins, who had ordered the killing. We're maybe not sure on the timing of that. But Winston Churchill assumed that it was the anti-treaty Four Courts garrison which was responsible. And so he warns Collins that if Collins doesn't step in to take over the garrison, then he will do so. These are the assassins, and they were executed by the British, hanged on the 10th of August in 22. So in the middle of June, the anti-treaty regulars who are based in the Four Courts kidnapped the Free State General J.J. Ginger O'Connell in retaliation for the arrest of the anti-treaty officer Leo Henderson. And then, as I say, because Michael Collins is under pressure from the government, he issues a final ultimatum to the Four Courts garrison to surrender the Four Courts before they are attacked on the 27th of June. On the 28th, the Civil War definitively starts as the provisional government bombards the Four Courts at 4:15 a.m. in the morning. Collins borrowed was lent two 18-pound field guns to carry out the offensive, and it was the first use of artillery by the Free State Army. Now, this whole Four Courts, I've messed up my timing. Sorry, I seem to have lost all of my Four Courts. I had a load of lovely pictures about the Four Courts for you. Hang on one second. Okay, I lost my Four Courts. I'll put them up later on. The Four Courts was a controversial subject in Irish history because, of course, the loss of the Public Records Office. The anti-treaty garrison were in the Northern Bloc, and that was kind of east of where the Public Records, I'm sorry, there's no visuals for this. And so everyone kind of talks about the Four Courts, which was the very obvious one, but the Public Records Office was kind of part of that campus. The attack by the National Army on this anti-treaty force is really seen as kind of central to modern Irish history. The Four Courts had been completed in the 19th century, and of course a huge physical presence on the docks, the quays in Dublin. And because it was so centrally located, and because this was kind of the first massive outbreak of fighting during the Civil War, the battle drew large crowds of spectators, and the action was comprehensively recorded in newsprint, photographs, and even newsreel footage, all of which I somehow lost for my presentation. So in spite of all the documentation of what went on at the time, it's kind of clear that no one really knew, they were calling it the Four Courts or they were calling it the building, but actually a lot of the damage happened in the Public Records Office. So at about 9 p.m. on the evening before the siege started, Major General Emmett Dalton, Commandant General Tony Lawler, Captain John Doyle, and a number of soldiers drove in 2 lorries to the back gate of Marlborough Barracks, where the 2 British Army 18-pound cannons and a supply of ammunition were handed over by the 17th Battery Royal Field Artillery. Dalton had fought in the British Army in the Great War. He had been awarded the Military Cross and entered the war with the rank of Major. Lawler had joined the Royal Flying Corps at the age of 18 and also fought for 2 years in World War I. So he kind of had a knowledge of artillery. They had both been students together at the Royal College of Surgeons, and they both joined the IRA on their return to Ireland after the war. Overseeing the handover of the guns on the British side was Major Colin Gubbins, who became actually commander of the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War. So the guns were handed over at 11:59 a.m. That's probably wrong. It was probably 11:59 p.m. because they attack in the middle of the night. It's hardly likely they sat on them all day. The guns probably came with a manual to tell them how to work it, because it was the first time they'd used it, and basically simple kind of directions for the 6-man crew who would be needed to work it. So I'm not going to go into exactly what does happen. Some people say that, we know they had kind of rigged inside in the Public Records Office and in the Four Courts. They were using the records. The IRA had definitely set, I had some pictures of the grenades and things. They had set, down this artillery, and they were probably storing their weapons there. So it is not that the IRA, anti-treaty IRA, set fire to the records. It was, they burned in a fire because they were bombed. So this fire rages for 2 days. I'm sorry, I lost the visuals. And on the 30th of June, the anti-treaty forces finally abandoned the Four Courts. And then there's another large explosion. Free State troops claim that the building was mined, but as I said, it's more likely that they were storing their ammunition in there, because they had been in there since April, so it was kind of a siege. Now, on the 7th of July, only a week later, Cathal Brugha became the first high-profile fatality of the Civil War during the Battle of Dublin, which followed this siege. He met his end at the back of the Hammond Hotel, which had been shelled by the National Army. He came out of the little laneway off O'Connell Street, firing his pistol, shell-shocked, and kind of walked right into the path of a National Army sniper and was felled with a single gunshot to the leg, which was a terrible irony because he had been shot 25 times during the Easter Rising, not actually far from this area. He'd been wounded at the South Dublin Union. Hadn't been expected to survive that, and although he walked with a limp for the rest of his life, he survived. And so very heartbreaking to think that, one shot. He died in hospital from shock and blood loss, and he left behind a widow and 6 children. There was no state ceremony to remember the first Count Corla, the Speaker of the House, and he was, of course, the Minister for Defence in the first Dáil, but he had become one of the most ferocious anti-treaty candidates. Brugha's death did come as a shock to both sides in the Civil War. He had, of course, had a most bitter falling out with Michael Collins. He accused him of being a glory hunter, kind of those treaty debates that we went through. They had had terrible words together, and claimed that, Collins was taking the credit which rightfully belonged to others. But on his death, Collins remarked, because of his sincerity, I would forgive him anything. At worst, he was a fanatic. At best, I number him among those who had given their all. And so, it was coming among women stood at his coffin that week. Fighting ends in Dublin in July 1922 as the anti-treaty troops surrender or flee. The Republican, there were 300 people killed during that time between kind of March and July in the capital, the vast majority of whom were civilians. Then in July, the cities of Limerick and Waterford also fought the provisional government. There's about 450 people killed in sectarian fighting in Belfast during June and July. So that kind of siege of Dublin went on for a long time. and is now over. So the fight goes down through the countryside and into kind of rural areas. The IRA derailed, here we go, a train carrying Free State Army soldiers and their prisoners at Killearn in Wexford, also in August. Well, I think, yeah, in August. The train was crowded with civilian commuters and left Wexford. The coaches next to the engine were occupied by an escort of Free State troops, and the third coach by a party of Republican prisoners who had been rounded up. So, you know, of course, the machine of government was moving on. What was envisioned as a relatively straightforward journey became one of the fiercest battles of the county civil war. The train came to a halt, and leaving it brutally exposed to their well-placed attackers, the Free State Army's position left them woefully exposed, and you'd want to be a bad shot to miss them, as one of the soldiers said later on. So eventually, fearing a Free State encirclement, the flying column from the IRA withdrew. None of the IRA prisoners on board the train attempted to escape, despite carrying keys to the carriages. Later, one of the prisoners said, under the circumstances, we felt that it would not be possible to make any attempt to get away, as it would mean passing down the embankment through the ranks of the Free State soldiers. So again, on the 4th of August, the first Cumann member was killed. Her name was Mary Hartney from Limerick City. The Free State Army were using artillery to drive the IRA from the town of Adair in County Limerick, and at the Dunraven Arms Hotel, which is where the Republicans had set up their headquarters, were hit in a barrage. Later on, apparently, a correspondent from the Army's publicity department reported that the rooms in the building were found to be spattered with blood, showing there must have been fairly severe casualties among the irregulars. In fact, only one member had been killed, Mary Hartney. She had been working as part of the first aid unit, and she's buried in the Republican plot in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery in Limerick. So, you know, there's a lot of other, you could be reading that letter while I'm talking that it isn't to do with this, but the Free State forces carry out the first seaborne landings in Cork. 1,000 men land in 3 separate landings at Passage West. I think I do have a photo of that somewhere. Maybe it came up earlier on. Anyway. At Passage West, Youghal and Glandore, there was heavy fighting in Rochestown as irregulars tried to halt the Free State advance on Cork City. In Emmett Dalton landed 800 soldiers of the Free State's army, artillery and armoured cars at Passage West. And so this kind of monster republic, you know, had been really fighting ferociously, guerrilla warfare like they had during the War of Independence. So there were several deaths on both sides. Then on the 31st of July, Harry Boland, of course, Easter Rising veteran, a prominent anti-treaty politician. He spent over a year in America when Javalera was here collecting money in the 20s. He was shot dead by Free State soldiers in the Grand Hotel Skerries and died days later. You know, of course, the very close friends with Michael Collins, both apparently in love with Kitty Kiernan. He knew his shooters because it took him a few hours to die, but he did not give their names because he did not want retribution. It's not clear what happened when the troops burst into Boland's hotel room. He was staying in a hotel with a man called Griffith. According to the Irish Times at the time, Boland was shot while resisting arrest and hit in the right abdomen. The report suggests that he tried to seize the gun of one of the arresting soldiers and ran down the corridor to get away. The troops, according to this account, fired 2 shots in the air and then one, the fatal one, to his body. Although, like, he was left for hours, you know, in a police van. Eventually, they brought him to a hospital. They wouldn't let his brother come see him, but they did allow his sister, I think, to go in. So, you know, he had a kind of a terrible death, not as it's portrayed in the film, you know, where he's running away in a sewer and he's killed. Michael Collins and Kitty Kiernan both wrote to each other about the death, and he absolutely regretted his friend. He wrote to Kitty Kiernan, "I passed Vincent's hospital and saw a crowd outside. My mind went into him, Harry, lying there dead, and I thought of all the times together. I've sent a wreath. Nevertheless, I suppose they should return it torn up." So now by this stage, Cork, Free State soldiers are in Cork. The anti-treaty forces abandoned that city. The anti-treaty move out of Fermoy, which is the last town under their control. And the Republicans now decide to abandon the policy of holding towns as much as they can. You know, they had taken control sort of different barricades and, or, you know, police stations and that kind of thing. And now they're not going to do that. They're going to go back to full-on guerrilla warfare. And then on the 12th of August, Arthur Griffith, the president, in the breakup in the Dáil, died in hospital from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 51 years old and succeeded by William Cosgrave. Now, Griffith's place in Irish history has, been kind of, you could say, overlooked. In fact, it took a while, I think, even for them to get it together this year to kind of commemorate his death. He certainly is never listed like among the glorious dead of sort of Collins and the 1916 heroes, He's been sidelined, relative to his contemporaries, for possibly party political reasons. In a recent article for the Irish Times, the writer Colm Kenny, who also wrote a biography of Griffith, said that the failure to honour him, notably in the centenary of his death, is a sin of omission by the government. Now, they did kind of pull it out at the last minute, and there was some commemorations. So Griffith, as you know, was born in Dublin in 1871, a writer, newspaper editor, and a politician, founder of the Sinn Féin political party. He wrote a treatise, that kind of talked about the dual monarchy in Austria-Hungary, and thought that would be a way for Ireland to devolve from England. He led naturally the Irish delegation in the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations and served as president of the Valera from January 22, when Javalera walks out, until his death. He worked for a time as a printer before joining the Gaelic League, promoting the restoration of the Irish language. And he did join the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, although he had originally been kind of a Parnellite, He visited South Africa from 1896 to 1898, and he supported the Boers in their campaign against British expansionism and was a supporter of Paul Kruger. And don't forget Jan Smuts, that later on gets involved, in these kind of pre-negotiations that allowed the British government and Sinn Féin to have the ceasefire in June of 21. That came out of Arthur Griffith's work. In 1899, and returning to Dublin, Griffith co-founded the weekly United Irishmen newspaper with his associate William Rooney, who died in 1901. In 1910, Griffith married his fiancée, Maud Sheehan, and they had a son and daughter. Griffith believed that real independence would have to be economic as well as political, that Ireland could never be independent while it depended on England for manufacturing. So he founded Sinn Féin, Ourselves Alone, or We Ourselves, and as you know, that party then advocated for the policy to abstain from Westminster and form a separate Irish government with an administrative system based on local government, but in Dublin. So he was elected as a Sinn Féin MP in East Cavan in 1918. And, he was very much not really involved in the violence, but absolutely in the running of the country. He was Minister for Home Affairs, I think, in that first Dáil. And then, naturally, Javalera was away, for that, so he was kind of managing that too. So they reckon kind of stress and exhaustion. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage, only 10 days, of course, before Michael Collins. Dermot Parrish, or another historian at home, says that Griffith was kind of airbrushed out of Irish history, and his widow, in fact, had to beg his former colleagues for a pension, writing that he had made them all, and how could they forget her? And then, of course, this is Michael Collins, one of the last kind of photographs of him at the funeral. And this is, again, one of the last kind of photographs. And then this is the last photograph, they reckon, of Michael Collins. There he is when the party had stopped en route. So he's touring through Cork in an attempt, Michael Collins, in an attempt to try to talk to the anti-treaty side. Don't forget, he had said prophetically after signing the treaty that he would, that he was going to, he had signed his own death warrant, and yet at the same time, this kind of devil-may-care attitude, which allowed him to kind of cycle around Dublin all during the War of Independence as the most wanted man, in the British Empire. Maybe that is kind of what led him to tour Cork. He said, "They will never kill me in my own county." So, not far really from his own family home, he's touring, as I say, through Bale na Blow, and so. Sorry, I'm just looking for my thing. There was 2 Free State soldiers killed, Corporal Thomas McMahon and Private Morris Quirk. Bale na Blow, if any of you have seen it, I probably do, that's that same photograph colorized. It's an ideal ambush country. Ronan McCreevy wrote in the Irish Times recently, the narrow road cuts through a deep valley with steep slopes on each side, running parallel to the road on the left. As Collins's convoy travelled from Bandon to Cork, is Long's Lane. It completely overlooks the road beneath and provides an ideal means of escape. So the terrain favored the ambusher. And, you know, the IRA knew this. They'd been doing it for 2 years against the Black and Tans. So when they come upon a roadblock, Emmett Dalton, who was Michael Collins, excuse me, he's a general, but he was with Collins in the car. He ordered the guy to drive like hell. And Collins countermanded it, allegedly by saying, you know, we have to engage the enemy. And so he got out of the car and apparently was standing in the open. Now, this is one of those things, too, that Michael Collins, for all of his, you know, he was director of intelligence for the IRB. He kind of commanded it, even though we said Colin Rua was Minister for Defence at the time. Michael Collins had not actually seen much active, if any, active fighting in the War of Independence. He had fought in 1916. He was aide de camp to James Connolly in the GPO. But actually, he was more behind the curtain in the War of Independence and pulling the strings and kind of strategizing the war. So, you know, some people claim, had he been a more experienced soldier, naturally, like, you would take cover instead of standing up and presenting yourself as a target. But it is, you know, there's a lot of questions. Why was he traveling in an open top car? Why did the convoy stop for directions at Long's Bar? So, like, giving information to any waiting scouts. Who knew he was going to be in that area? You know, why did they come back the same way they had gone and in enemy territory too? So one of the men who's involved in the Kilmurray Independence Museum, local historian Noel Howard, who was also involved in the local defence force, the FCA, believes there were a lot of unanswered questions about his death. And, you know, don't forget the body wasn't autopsied. But this man, Neil Howard, said, I have trained military personnel for 41 years and some things are beyond comprehension. I still meet military colleagues and we go for a drink once a month. We come up here and look down. It's inexplicable. They could not understand, he says, what happened here. So he thinks it's kind of that bravura, you know, machismo that Collins had, rather than any, because some people claim it was a ricochet of a gun bullet off one of the hills. But the careless way that the provisional government handled the aftermath, of course, has led to a century of speculation and rumour. Two anti-treaty soldiers, Patrick O'Mahony and William Harrington, were killed during the Battle of Limerick that we just kind of touched on in July. Those foot soldiers, who really no one knows, you know, got inquests, but the commander-in-chief of the National Army did not. Dalton, who was with Collins in the car and took over in Cork, specifically banned inquests in the county after Collins was shot. So not long after, the American author Sigerson described the ban on inquests as an unbelievable travesty tolerated by the provisional government. The Dáil should have been invested, that Dalton should have been invested with such authority or allowed to retain such authority after he himself had been present at the killing of his superior officer is inconceivable in itself. So the rumours in Ireland are, if it wasn't kind of an IRA sanctioned execution, you know, by the anti-treaty forces, was it friendly fire, accidental or otherwise, by his own crowd, or was it a British kind of cabal, you know, that had come over to get him in the end, even though they seemed to be working with him. So no inquiry was carried out and the death certificate wasn't really issued. There was an autopsy report completed by Dr. Oliver St. John Gogarty, but was not made public. So we don't really know what weapon was used to kill him. How come he was the only fatality in an ambush that lasted up to an hour? And, you know, that central question of who killed Michael Collins has not been answered. They thought in the 1990s there was a documentary done, The Shadow of Béal na Blá, by Jim Carney, who he was the last surviving member. He named off camera a man called Dennis Sonny O'Neill, who was a veteran of the First World War. But recent evidence presented by Paddy Cullivan tells us that O'Neill had 40% disability in his left arm. And there's no evidence to suggest he was this kind of crack shot sniper. And there's even doubt if Carney was in the area on the evening in question. Sigerson at the time believed that the killing was more likely the work of the British Secret Service, and that a certain section within the Irish cabinet were alarmed by Collins's desire to end partition by force if necessary, because don't forget he is still involved in arming the North. Kieran Fitzpatrick, another member of the curating team at this Kilmurray Museum, said there is so much happenstance at Ballinablaw to suggest a conspiracy, and it's most likely that the ambush party did not set out to kill Collins as such, but that, again, maybe this bullet, ricocheted off. The obituary in The Guardian 100 years ago stated that the headline was "The Lost Leader." Michael Collins was a man it is impossible to replace because he was a legend as well as himself. And there was a closer resemblance between the romantic image of him projected on the public imagination and the man himself than is common. He had a natural valor which opened all hearts. He was very firm of purpose, and yet a gay, exuberant, laughing man. Gloom, cynicism, derision, despair, all peculiarly Irish devils, could not hold up their heads in his company. He had a double dose of vitality, and it drove through him and round him like a wind in a wood. He had interest to spare for each experience as it came, and for everyone he met, though his purpose in life remained concentrated and fixed. His face wore two expressions, each of which altered it so much that he seemed hardly the same man. In one case, his features would be set in a brooding scowl of powerful, almost somnolent determination. At another moment, he resembled a rollicking cherubic schoolboy. Ireland and he, like woman and man, expected each other, understanding each other. He responded both to romantic tradition and democratic good fellowship. He was a greedy reader of good books and tore his way through a surprising number of them. His scholarship, no doubt, was meagre, but he could read Greek with the help of a dictionary and a crib, and he loved it, which may astonish. If he had lived to direct the fortunes of Ireland, Irish men of letters would never have had to complain that their Prime Minister was indifferent to literature. Although a man who believed in his star, as fortified as he was by his unquenchable gaiety, Michael Collins thought of himself as a doomed man. On one occasion, he is said to have remarked to Mr. Churchill, it is not at all unlikely that the best thing that can happen to Ireland is that I should be killed in an attempt to redeem its cause. So, the mythologizing of this man began almost in his lifetime, immediately after his own death. A century on from his death, Michael Collins' enduring popularity owes much to the circumstances which, saw him killed as a young, handsome leader struck down in his prime. His ascent mirrors the descent of his political nemesis, Eamon Javalera, who died at 92 rather than 31. And that was tough. Javalera was gradually seen as becoming more and more out of touch with a modernizing Ireland. He was literally blind, lived out the last 14 years of his public life as President of Ireland in, isolation in what used to be the Viceregal Lodge in the Phoenix Park. So Michael Collins seems this evergreen, kind of glamorous fighter, and Javalera lived, to outlive that. His grave today is still the most frequently visited site in Bath 7 Cemetery. Daily floral tributes of appreciation are left, including one by a French woman who comes veiled every year. So there are some romantic overtones, which is a curious sense of intimacy for a figure who has been dead for a century. Among the items at the moment, the National Museum of Ireland have the overcoat that Michael Collins wore on the night of his death, his sidearm, and the pen that he used to sign the treaty. He was, of course, chairman of the provisional government of the new Irish Free State and leader of its armed forces on the day he died. So there he is in Cork, the overcoat that he wore, the car, is in the museum, his hat, which I think has a bullet hole in it. There's his death mask. And here he is. So, the interesting thing is some of the soldiers, apparently like the men in Kilmainham jail, the anti-treatyites, fell to their knees and said the rosary. His death, this is his brother at his coffin, his death touched on both sides, and absolutely after his death is when the Free State decided to kind of ramp things up in terms of retaliation. We saw that Collins didn't really, there were all these sort of mini attacks, and the IRA anti-treaty held certain towns and fought for every barracks that was handed over by the British. The anti-treaty were there, trying to take control of it. Collins really put off attacking them on a large scale until they were in the forecourts and kind of easier to get. Look at 1916 and the War of Independence, but also because of the pressure the British put him under because of the death of Wilson. So it's after his death you know, that the violence kind of ratchets up on both sides. And the sad thing in a way is, and I think we'll see more of that as these talks continue, that just because the Dáil split in January, the Civil War hadn't really been seen, I suppose, as inevitable until later, you know. So it starts to get a little bit violent in March. The continuing violence up north, of course, is of a slightly different tenor. But, you know, and I think you can see that some of those speeches, you know, given by, for instance, Javalera and things, where they're kind of saying there's no way out of this except through each other, kind of, you know, heated up the temperature. So when the IRA splits, which was not at the same time as the January Dáil vote, now you have two opposing military factions, and that sort of makes the military or paramilitary confrontation a little bit more inevitable. So I'm going to try to look for my four courts stuff. I don't know where. I had about 10 fantastic slides on the four courts, and they just got lost somewhere. Oh, I want to talk to you. Sorry about that letter. I think that was, I just want to show you this letter because I think it's fascinating. Sure. So, last. Share screen. Sorry, hang on. It's not sharing. This letter was written by Michael Collins, look, in late August, 2 or 3 days only before he died, which is incredible, to Diarmaid Fawcett, who was basically, well, the Minister of Economic Affairs, but he becomes, I think, more or less Ireland's first Consul General to New York. And maybe you can't read this. It says, "Many thanks for yours of today, enclosing me a letter from James Maguire. I do hope you have communicated the facts of Boland's arrest to the writer," because don't forget, Harry Boland had lived in New York for about 2 years. And traveled the country, "for whom I have a very great respect, knowing so well the work he had done for Ireland." So there's obviously a bit of pushback in America on Harry Boland's death. "I would ask you as a personal favour to tell him that he need not waste his time nor his energy in inducing any of the American Irish not to come here to slay Dick Mulcahy and myself." So James Maguire had read, like, "I'm having an awful hard time. American Irish are going to pile over and kill Richard Mulcahy or you, because of what you've done to Harry Boland." He said, "I have not the slightest doubt that we should be able to stand up to such gentlemen as we did to other gentlemen of the same persuasion for 2 or 3 years. It is a pity they did not show the same desire to come to help us when we were all fighting for our lives against the British. It was then they let us down, and some of us are not likely to forget it, and are not likely to look their way for assistance again. Please tell this to Mr. J.K. Maguire just as I put it, and tell him that my message to his friends is let them all come." And 3 days later, you know, he was killed. So, but it'll tell you the tension that's happening in Irish America, which we might do a separate talk on at some point. You know, Javalera had been here with Harry Boland. We talked about this, I think, before. The Friends of Irish Freedom split because of Javalera's tour across America in 1920. You know, he spends all of 1920, which is the first year really of the War of Independence, or, you know, the second year of the War of Independence over here. The money doesn't make it to Ireland. You know, he's representing Ireland as the president, living in the Waterford Story and all these other hotels. And so that faction that splits the Freedom Friends of Irish Freedom becomes the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic. That's the kind of pro-Javalera side, and it has fractured Irish America. So, you know, it's very interesting what's going on here. So honestly, I think by the time the Civil War happens, a lot of Irish America decides, you know, they're going to have to paddle their own canoe. Very involved, don't forget, in 1916, like Casement was over here with Devoy. It was from New York that Casement was sent to Germany to get the arms. But I think the Civil War kind of, and some Americans do go back to fight, don't get me wrong, but it's because the movement is so fractured already, it's interesting, you know. But it's, I think, very, Collins, you know, hadn't made it to America. He wanted to come in 1920 and Javalera wouldn't kind of send him here. And of course, you know, Michael Collins was the Minister for Finance, so it would have made sense maybe for him to be here fundraising, but didn't come. And so, you know, you wonder how much he felt sidelined, you know, too. So you guys should be able to like make yourself available to ask a question. I see Brian had said the sound wasn't coming through, but I think, Brian, that was just on that video, which seemed to delay a bit, and that is available on YouTube. Now, what was I going to say? Yeah, so if I can find my things, I'd love it, but I have not found that. I don't know, I must have deleted slides, but I look for them. So probably some of you have questions about the forecourts. We can go into that a little bit more if you'd like. The burning of the forecourts, you know, definitely, like for most of my life, I think the popular theory had been that the anti-treaty side, you know, were the ones who started it, and that they kind of on purpose detonated, you know, these things. That doesn't appear to be what happened. We had a talk with Kieran Wallace from, there's a new crowd, the Beyond 22, and they have kind of reconstructed, which is fantastic, the archives, but they're all I can't even think, sorry. They feel that probably what had happened was everyone was stocked up, you know, the artillery was stocked up and things, but they could have, so it was this fire that started that actually, you know, set off the thing. Now, Owen, I can't remember who asked, one of the anti-treatyites pleaded, like, can we please take out the boxes? You know, he was a history professor. We have to get rid of these archives, but they were just used to barricade doors and stuff. So there was kind of nothing malicious. Regina, I think you have your hand up, and you probably had it up for an hour. I'm so sorry. Did you have a question? So everyone that's in Zoom, you can just like unmute your microphone now. You should be able to see that. And if you do have a question, or type it into the chat or the Q&A. Oh yeah, good. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, it was YouTube video. Yeah, it just took ages to load. I think because the start of it, they're using that Pathé silent footage, you know. So I will, if no one has a question, I'll share my screen very quickly just to show you. I had some of these photographs ready from, it's actually from an article in the Irish Times, which is pretty good. So I'll just kind of scroll through it. We don't really know what's the deal with licensing laws and everything, but we're giving credit to them. So I'll just show you these pictures at least, and then that article is very interesting too if you wanted to read it. So here's, you know, the explosion at the forecourts, which again, you know, is probably wasn't intentional. And so that's what I was saying, like the forecourts themselves are here, the public records office is down the back. I think there's a map here, but you can see like the shelling, you know, broke windows. So it was sort of inevitable, right, that something would catch fire. You know, here's the Free State soldiers lined up outside it. And this is a Free State soldier preparing shells. So we said, you know, it was a 6-man team that would have to man these guns, and they were probably given about 2 hours of instructions on how to use it. So here's the entire, this is the river, you know, the forecourts were here. That's the public records office. So like the fighting was contained to this district, but this was kind of the most visible in one way. And of course here then is where the public records were kept. So I think there's another map. Yeah, so like this is as you face the building, you know, they're shooting the 18-pounder. So it's absolutely likely that something went in at the back. And here's the visible shell strikes then. So visibly, you know, the pro-treaty side shelled in, which, you know, let's see. So I don't think they bombed it, that the anti-treaty people bombed it. Here's one of the wounded rebels once they surrender, and the arrest of Father Dominic. So, you know, that man that wrote that article, it's whatever happened at the forecourts, you know, they're trying to piece it together because it has been pretty contentious, you know, throughout my lifetime. So sorry, I see questions now. I just recently read that Michael Collins' hat was in the Dublin museums had been removed out of sensitivity, not had a hole but spattered material. Wow. Yeah, isn't that interesting? So Brian said the hat. I remember taking students, I taught high school in Ireland, and I took students to see it. And I mean, yeah, that's a very interesting thing to take out. I don't think I would have removed it. You know, I mean, you don't want mold or fungus, but they have ways surely of, you know, kind of storing it. But it's interesting, you know, what, I mean, even to be honest, I worried in a way about sharing the photos of, you know, his body lying in state and all. Irish people, of course, are used to going to wakes and things, but it's, you know, I wonder why they removed it. I definitely, it made a great impression on me, I have to say, seeing the hat, and you know, his overcoat was there and the car was there. So, yeah, I don't think I would have taken it out because they have the means to keep it so that it's not, you know, rotting or anything. Did anyone else have a question or a comment? Janine, were you having your hand up? Or Regina, I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Maybe you were just saying hi. I'll check the crowd on YouTube too. I don't want to, you know, over talk. But if you have questions or comments, I'd like to, you know, answer them. So yeah. No questions or comments. So this series will continue. We probably might not do it monthly. September is pretty full, but we will continue it because from now on is where the Civil War becomes, you know, I suppose the stuff of like The Wind That Shakes the Barley, those movies, the Ballyseedy tragedy in Kerry doesn't happen until next year. So, you know, we kind of took a break from it just because while I do find the election very interesting in particular, but also the Four Courts debacle, it's not until now that the Civil War, you know, kind of heats up. And it's interesting that, you know, they reckon maybe 2,000 people lost their lives in it. So it isn't by any means, you know, like a massive, like America's Civil War obviously is huge, but it's interesting because the population, particularly the fact that it was fought along the same lines as the War of Independence itself, like it's a very, very draining, you know, kind of event to go through. And I think particularly because our political system, you know, our political parties are still founded from that period. I was saying it was very difficult this year for the government to manage those commemorations. Like, you know, they did a fantastic job, like on 1916, on the War of Independence, and there was moments of issue there too. I don't know if you remember that, you know, there was a monument that listed all of the dead from the war, including the RIC, many of whom were Irish Catholic, you know, policemen, and that kept getting defaced. So we've had issues with commemorating everyone who died, but it seems easier to commemorate it when there was sort of a more or less common enemy, you know, being Britain, as opposed to now when we're in the Civil War. So they did a fantastic ceremony. It's available to watch online down in Cork. And for the first time, I suppose, in a way, both parties, you know, sort of honoured Michael Collins. Usually it's just Fine Gael, you know, they kind of get to claim him. But this year, both of them did. A question: is there a further source or two you would recommend that clearly conveys? Yeah, there are some brilliant writings. I suppose part of the problem, you know, is that people are so one-sided. So, like, you know, I definitely enjoy Tim Pat Coogan's biographies of both Javalera and Michael Collins. I'm just going to Google the name of the book. There was a new book, it was something like, Between Two Hells. So I actually really appreciate Diarmaid Ferriter. He's a very good professor of modern Irish history at UCD. He's done a lot of documentaries and stuff. So he has a new book out called Between Two Hells, The Irish Civil War. And, you know, a lot of the time in older books, you know, the men are mythologized, women are often sidelined, you know, to be quite honest. And so, you know, he's a very thorough historian that looks at kind of other sources. So he wrote a book, for instance, years ago called The Transformation of Ireland, 1900 to 2000. And it was absolutely brilliant, you know, because he sort of interrogates the myth that, you know, oh, sure, once we got our independence, we were grand, you know. So I haven't read this new one, what did I call it, Between Two Hells, but absolutely, he's a brilliant historian. So, and I think it'll be, you know, he won't be kind of pulling any punches in it. We must actually get him to give a talk maybe for us. He's very good. So thank you, Brian, for that. Any other questions? So, you know, yeah, like I enjoy Jolie's work. I'm trying to think if he had written specifically on the Civil War. Cork historian, taught in NYU for a long time. I'd say my own features probably, yeah, well, Joe Lee wrote a kind of a survey course in 1912 to 1985, Politics and Society. That is the kind of a standard, you know, very good book. But it doesn't only deal, you know, with the Civil War. I am sure that I'm just going to Google Ronan Fanning. He taught me at UCD. He was amazing as well. And Michael Laffan. They must both have books on that. Well, so Ronan Fanning wrote about Eamon Javalera, and he's written Fatal Pact. So Fatal Pact, British Government and the Irish Revolution, 1910 to 1922. That's Ronan Fanning. He's a brilliant historian, and you know, I suppose I only grew up knowing what I knew. Michael Laffan has a series of his lectures from UCD are available online at the History Hub, and he has done a lot of work as kind of podcasts on the Civil War. I'll write that in now, no problem. Michael Laffan, he's retired now, and actually poor Ronan has died. Michael Laffan and Ronan Fanning. But I do think Diarmaid Ferreter's book is probably going to be, you know, because it's the most recent, so it's up to date. It is, as I say, more kind of interrogative than we sometimes eulogize the thing, you know. And so I really do enjoy him as a historian. Oh, he's not Diarmaid Woods, he's Diarmaid. Okay. I'm just typing his name here for you. Diarmaid Ferreter. Okay. So guys, that was great. A kind of a short and sweet overview, but we'll kind of go back, as I say, maybe I'll do one in October, looking at the events in September, October. And I will say per force going forward, these will be much more local based. So, you know, there is certain atrocities committed on both sides that we'll look at. But, you know, this was kind of the big one where politics, again, and it's so interesting, you know, you would think that the politics would have put an end to it. Like, they have these elections, people win their election by contesting what they contest, and you know, it wasn't enough for the army. So there's a lot of work I think that we can do on looking at the anti-treaty side, but I'm excited to go forward with it again. So I'll just tell you while you're here, our next event is the 30th. We have Colette doing a Zoom, the sales kind of thing, for an Irish trip next year. And then on the 6th of September, we're starting our new Great Hunger series to commemorate the 175th anniversary of Black 47. So I'll give the first talk. It will be live here, but we'll also stream it. And it's called Bread or Blood, the Great Hunger in a Typical Irish Town. Then we have a fantastic Irish actor and comedian, Kevin Flynn. He'll be here on the 16th, which we can't live stream. It's a show, Fear of Heights. His grandfather was actually one of the men on that kind of iconic, you know, the men at lunch on the steel beam. Then we have the second lecture on the 21st, Government Relief and Private Charity During the Great Hunger, with Dr. Karen Sonnenleiter. So that'll be in person, but we'll also stream it. And on the 28th, we have a fantastic talk with a historian from Ireland, John Joe McGinley. It's going to be about Irish wise guys and different gangsters, and kind of the changeover from gangs of New York style violence, excuse me, through kind of prohibition, and when the mafia oust the Irish from it. Excuse me. So we're looking forward to that. So there, you know, there's a number of talks on. I'm giving several talks for other places that will also link. They'll all be online. So thank you very much, guys, and keep an eye on our Facebook page or Twitter or Instagram, and of course the website irishus.org. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night. Good to see you.